Okay, so your first assignment is to find the book of Daniel. I'll give you a hint. Daniel is one of the major prophets, which is second to the last section of the Bible, the last section of the Hebrew Bible, that is. The last section is the book of 12. Those are the minor prophets. And Daniel is actually after the three main major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Okay, so the book of Daniel is designated as a book of prophecy, not because it resembles the other books of prophecy, which consist primarily of a series of oracles. Like if you read through Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, what you'll read is, "Thus says the Lord," and then they'll say what they think the Spirit is inspiring them to say. The book of Daniel is not like that at all. It can be divided up into two sections. Chapters 1 to 6 is a series of stories about Daniel and three of his friends who are given Persian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's not their Hebrew names, by the way. Daniel's given a Hebrew name too. What was it? I forget exactly what it was. It's in here somewhere. Anyway, but he refers to himself as Daniel throughout the book. Okay, so the first 6 chapters are a series of stories. Then chapters 7 through 12 are a series of visions that Daniel has. And as a part of that section, Daniel also offers a long prayer to God, and he speaks to an angel who helps him interpret the visions. Okay, so there's 12 chapters in this book, making it quite long. So in an hour's time, we don't have time to go through everything in this book. Here's the best we can do. The best we can do is take a look at 2 of the familiar stories in the first 6 chapters and talk about what they mean and why they were written the way they were. And then take an overall look at the visions, which are much like the book of Revelation visions. You know, there's these beasts that arise, and then another beast devours that beast, and another beast devours that beast. Well, these are personifications for empires. So you have to know something about the history of Judah to understand Daniel. It isn't possible to understand Daniel without understanding the history. It's just absolutely necessary. Okay, now Daniel writes in the opening part of the book, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, okay, so that means the kingdom of Israel to the north has already been exiled in 721. We're in 587 BC. And King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes, besieges Jerusalem, and it falls. The temple is destroyed, and the people of Judah are taken into exile and settled south of the city of Babylon on the Tigris River. That's where they end up. Okay? It's not a bad place to live, actually, because the river serves as the necessary water to raise crops and so forth. So it's not like they were exiled to some wilderness where you couldn't, full of scorpions or something. It wasn't that bad. In fact, when the exiles returned 50 years later, some of them stayed in Babylon because they built a life there. Yeah. So they didn't all return. Okay, so you would think then that Daniel was written somewhere near or right after the exile. That's what you would think, right? But you would be wrong in thinking that. In fact, Daniel was written, most people think, in the year 169, the 2nd century BC. Now, what was going on in Judah in the 2nd century BC? Okay, so the history of Judah is the history of a series of empires. All right, so you've got the, prior to the destruction of Judah, you've got the first big empire, which was the Assyrian Empire. They are the ones that conquered the northern kingdom and exiled the 10 northern tribes. And at that time, the kingdom of Judah increased in its population over tenfold, which means many of those potential exiles fled into Judah. Okay, so the next empire to come along, personified as a beast, destroying the next beast, was Babylon. Babylon was under King Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon besieged Jerusalem in 587 BC and exiled the Judeans to Babylon. They left a few poor peasants behind because they didn't think there were any security risk. These people were poor. They lived off the land. They had maybe a sheep or two. But everybody else had to go. Okay, if you had any wealth and power, you had to go. All right, so Daniel was among the exiles. Then you have the next empire that comes out of the east. Now, Babylon is in current-day Iraq. The next empire came from current-day Iran, the Persians. Under King Cyrus, 50 years after Babylon destroys Judah, you got King Cyrus expanding his empire westward. And he swallows up Babylon, and he gets all the way to Greece, but the Greeks are able to defeat him in a battle. So Cyrus has a different policy when it comes to the peoples he conquers. Okay, the policy of the Babylonians and the Assyrians was that for the sake of the security of the empire, they would exile peoples to foreign lands so that they couldn't organize and rebel. The philosophy that Cyrus had, and even to this day, Israel honors King Cyrus. They put him on their coins. Yeah. King Cyrus had an entirely different policy. His idea was you should leave the people in their own land to worship their own gods and their own temples and their own palaces. That way they won't want to rebel. Okay? So when King Cyrus defeats the Babylonians, he tells the Judeans, you can go back home. In fact, he even finances the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So this is in 50 years from 587 is about 535, somewhere in there. The exiles return under Ezra and Nehemiah, and Jewish law is codified. It was at this time that the Torah was put together. Okay, the first 5 books of the Bible, as we know it, were collected, as well as the prophets. Okay, so Judah becomes a Persian province under the direction of a Persian governor to make sure that taxes were collected, of course. That lasts until Alexander the Great, a Macedonian, a Greek, tutored by Aristotle. He was an amazing military genius. The guy just swept over the whole Mediterranean region. His goal was to Hellenize the entire Mediterranean region. He wanted to introduce Greek culture everywhere because he believed in the superiority of the Greeks All other peoples were referred to as barbarians. The Greeks had the literature, the Greeks had the philosophy, the Greeks had science, the Greeks had medicine, the Greeks had art, the Greeks had it all. And so he was going to introduce Greek culture. He got all the way to the border with India, and his army said, Alexander, we're not going any further. This is it. Okay, we're done. We're done here. So he returns, he goes to Alexandria, which is a city in Egypt named after him. And there he dies at age 32, which means he conquered all these lands in his 20s. Yeah, it's an amazing story. Okay, now when he dies, there's no king to succeed him. So the empire is divided up among his generals. First there's 4, then one of them falls off the map. I don't remember why, so it ends up being 3. And now Judah is under the rule of a general who is based in Syria. It was called the Seleucids. Okay, and now that's going to become extremely important when we get into the book of Daniel here. Okay, because that's when it was written. It was written while Judah was under Greek rule. From around 332, okay, until the Jews rebel in the year 167 BC under Judas Maccabeus. All right, if you look at a Catholic Bible, it has the books of the Maccabees in it. That's the family that led the rebellion. And believe it or not, they won their independence. Okay? So, they're independent under the rule of the Maccabean family for about 100 years. Until the year 64, I believe it was 64, or 66, one of the two. And there was a dispute over who was going to be high priest. And this Roman general, who's expanding the borders of the Roman Empire, you can see why the Jewish prophets looked at human history. And what they saw was just a series of one empire after the next, after the next, after the next. Okay, and they wondered, what's God's role in this? Is God directing this? Is this under God's providence? And is it leading to a divine goal? Daniel addresses that question in his visions. Okay, so anyway, back to Jewish history. They come under the Roman Empire when Pompey comes through in 64 BC. Okay, so we'll stop there. You don't need to go any further on that. All right, so now, if you read the book of Daniel, what you discover is that the first 6 chapters are stories about Jews who stand up for their own religion. When somebody tries to force them to bow down to a pagan god or to a king or something else, they refuse. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse, so they end up in the fiery furnace. Daniel refuses, so he ends up in the den of lions. Right? Okay, so when were these stories written and for what purpose? These stories were written at the time of Greek rule when a guy named Antiochus IV was persecuting the Jews and trying to impose Greek cultural norms on the Jewish people. And he tried to go about that by forcing it down their throats. Okay? He outlawed the observance of the Sabbath. He would sprinkle swine's blood in the temple. Okay? You can imagine how the Jews felt about that. He had them compete in athletic competitions in the nude. which offended Jews. For the Greeks, this was not an issue. That's the way they did it. But Jews, no. That's not something you do. You don't expose yourself. Okay? And they could no longer observe their festivals. But the straw that broke the camel's back, that led to the revolt, was when Antiochus tried to put a statue of the Greek god Zeus in the temple. That did it. They called that the abomination of desolation. That's what it's called in Daniel. All right, so that's what triggered the revolt. All right, and like I say, they won their independence for 100 years. Okay, so back up to about 2 years before that happens. The Jews are in the midst of persecution. The book of Daniel is written to address the Jewish people in a time of hardship, in a time when they're being forced to do things that are against God's law, in a time when people are trying to make them unrighteous in the sight of God from their perspective. From their point of view, they are obligated to observe the laws of Moses. That's what it means to be God's people. And here's this guy Antiochus trying to force them to become Greeks instead. Many people suffered under this rule. Many people were put to death. Many people, if they resisted, it was very negative consequences. Okay? So Daniel writes these stories set in the time of the Babylonian exile, but they're stories that address the very things that the Jews are going through under Antiochus and Greek rule. All right? So let's go back to the stories for a minute. Daniel has 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All of them are pious Jews who observe God's law. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar is kind of a nut. He's portrayed as kind of a nut in here, just like Antiochus was. I mean, if you read Daniel and you switch the name Nebuchadnezzar for Antiochus, you got an idea of what this guy was like. All right? So, Nebuchadnezzar decides that the kings at that period in human history had egos that were so big they couldn't be contained. This guy builds a golden statue of himself, and he issues a decree. Whenever the horn, the lyre, the bells, the drums, all the musical instruments in their ensemble, whenever they ring, everybody bows down to the statue of the king. That's what the edict was. And if you do not bow down to the statue of the king, you will be thrown into the fiery furnace. All right. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who otherwise had a good relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, refused to bow down to the statue. So Nebuchadnezzar, who doesn't really want to throw them in the fiery furnace, gives them a second chance. He says, bring them here. He says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know you're supposed to bow down to my statue when the musical ensemble rings. But you're not doing it. And they reply to Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, we will never bow down to your statue. We serve the Most High God. That's who we serve, and that's the only one we'll serve. Now, if you throw us into the fiery furnace, perhaps our God will save us. But whether he does or whether he doesn't, we serve him, and only him. Okay? So Daniel is presenting to a people who are trying to resist Greek tyrannical rule. Daniel is presenting examples of people who stood up to the tyrannical rule of Nebuchadnezzar and who survived to tell about it. All right? So So Daniel is giving these people encouragement and hope in the midst of persecution. All right, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar is so enraged. He says, make that fire 7 times hotter than it normally is. Well, you know, the number 7 is a symbolic number for Jews. It means complete, because there's 7 days in a week. Okay, so it means that you couldn't make the fire any hotter than it was. That's the hottest you could make it. It was so hot that when they threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, the people who threw him in were killed from the heat of the fire. Then the next day, the king gets up and he's got this window that looks into the furnace. He wants to see what happened to him. He looks in there and he sees 4 figures standing, walking around in flames. And he can't believe what he sees. So he runs around, he says, let him out of the furnace. And they come out, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, O king, our God sent an angel to protect us, so the flames did not harm us. Nebuchadnezzar says, oh, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you serve the Most High God. And then he issues another edict. Anyone who blasphemes against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb. Okay. So, that's the first story. These stories have become so familiar in Daniel that they become part of our culture, kind of like David and Goliath. It's part of the culture. Everybody knows it. All right, the next story everybody knows. Daniel and the lion's den, right? All right, something similar happens there. What happens there is that the king he issues an edict that people have to pray to his image. I think it's once a day or something like that. People have to pray to his image. And I think we're at the next king now, Nebuchadnezzar's son. And Daniel, okay, so now Daniel, because Daniel could interpret the king's dreams, just like Joseph, remember Joseph and Pharaoh? And Joseph ends up with a high position. For the same reason, Daniel has a high position in Babylonia, because he can interpret the king's dreams. And nobody else can. Okay. So, there are some people who are very jealous of Daniel. So jealous that they want to get rid of him. So they come to the king. And they say, Daniel is not praying to your image, O king. May you live forever. Daniel is not praying to your image. So according to your edict, Daniel has to be thrown in the den of the lions. And the king is just grief-stricken because he likes Daniel. No, I don't want to throw him in the den of the lions. So he says, bring Daniel here. Daniel comes to the king. Daniel says, O king, may you live forever. He had to say that. I'm sorry, O king, I cannot pray to your image. I only pray to the living God, the God who created all things. I can't pray to your image. I can't disobey my God. It's worse than death to disobey God. So do with me whatever you wish. Well, the king hopes that Daniel will be saved, because he still likes him. But he has to throw him into the den of lions. So he reluctantly does that, throws Daniel in there. Daniel prays, and the lions just sit there content. They don't do a thing. They eat the straw. The king wakes up the next day really anxious. He looks in the den of lions, hoping Daniel is still alive. And he sees him and he rejoices. Daniel, you're still there. Your God's delivered you from the lions. And then he lets lets him out. They check him. There's no harm done. The king gets angry at the people who put Daniel in there, and he throws them and their families in there instead. And of course, they're devoured by the lion. So Daniel, so once again, you've got a story of a faithful Jew who stood up to somebody who tried to force them to do something against their own religion. They refused, they remained faithful to God, and God delivered them. Now, there's no promise in these stories that God will always deliver you. The stories always have a happy ending, but there's no promise of that. Okay, even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, maybe God will save us, maybe he won't. Nevertheless, these stories are encouraging the Jews to remain faithful to their God, even though the state, okay, in the person of the king, the state is telling them to do otherwise. Okay? So these stories apply. Many Christians understood these stories to apply to them when Hitler came to power in Germany. Because Hitler tried to change the church so it was consistent with Nazi theory. And, very few German pastors resisted. There's one very famous who did. Who's that? Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer resisted. And of course he ended up in a concentration camp. So anyway, Bonhoeffer's faith in God was so strong that when the Nazi authorities were trying to dispatch people before the Allies got to the concentration camps and liberated them, because they knew they were going to get there eventually, they had him hung. He didn't resist. He just walked. So the point of these first 6 chapters is that your relationship with God is so precious that it doesn't make any difference if someone is trying to get you to do something that will break your relationship with God. Resist at all costs. Resist. That's what these stories are about. Okay? Now, the second part of Daniel is a series of visions. This is why Daniel is considered a prophet, because he has these visions. Okay, now, the visions are extremely detailed. I read through them all again yesterday and last night, trying to figure out, am I going to be able to talk about all these visions? And then I realized there's no way, there's too much here. It's just, so what I can do is give you an idea of the purpose of these visions, and then a couple of concepts in these visions that become extremely important in the New Testament. Okay. All right, in chapter 7, in the first vision, Daniel sees Daniel sees 4 beasts. Okay, now here's what the 4 beasts are. 4 beasts are first Babylon, secondly Persia, thirdly Alexander, and fourthly the generals that take over after Alexander. Those are the 4 beasts. Daniel is written before the Romans, so the Romans don't play a role in Daniel. Okay? And each beast devours the next one. But in the visions, God is in charge of what is happening. All of this is leading to a goal, preordained by God from all eternity. God has predestined that his kingdom will rule forever. So all four of these beasts are preordained to last for a time and then be destroyed. To last for a time and then be destroyed. Now the really important part of this vision comes in verse 13 of chapter 7. He says, "As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being." Actually, the better translation is a son of man. I saw one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. Where have you heard that before? Remember your New Testament. And what Jesus said to his accusers, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." And he came to the Ancient One. That's God. Ancient One means eternal. And was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. In other words, this human being who came on the clouds of heaven, or this being who resembled a human being and came on the clouds of heaven, would be given dominion of the kingdom of God. And all peoples on the earth would serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Now this harkens back to the covenant God made with David when he said, "David, from your descendants will come a king of whose kingdom there is no end." And they all connect directly to Jesus. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man more often than he does use any other term. He refers to himself as the Messiah only when he faces his accusers in the Gospel of Mark. They ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" And he says, "Yes, I am." He refers to himself as the Son of God in the Gospel of John. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's always the Son of Man. So he'll tell a parable and he'll say, he'll say the Son of Man. Or he'll ask them a question, like remember when he took the disciples to Caesarea Philippi and he said, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" In other words, who do people say that I am? So Daniel's vision and the New Testament are inextricably connected. This is the only vision in the Hebrew Bible that mentions a Son of Man. It comes directly from Daniel. So Daniel is an extremely important book for the New Testament. There are many connections to Jesus in the Old Testament, of course. With the promise to Abraham that from him will come a blessing that will bless all peoples, the suffering servant in Isaiah, Isaiah's predictions of a paradise in the future. All of that refers back to Jesus, but this one is explicit, using the title, the Son of Man. Okay? So, and saying that he will be given the kingdom by God himself, the Ancient One, and his dominion shall be everlasting. All right, so Daniel's visions are saying that the rise of all these different empires is preordained by God. Right? That what they do, the evil they commit, God does not cause them to commit the evil. They are responsible for that. But God sees what they're going to do, and he's in control of it. It's the same as, if you look at, let's bring the same theme down to one person. The story of Joseph. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, right? An evil act. But ultimately, and God didn't make his brothers do it. They were responsible. But how did God make it turn out? Joseph becomes the leader of Egypt, and he's able to feed his brothers during a famine. Okay. Well, this is the same idea. These empires arise, one after the next, personified by these beasts, and they devour one another, committing all kinds of desolation and desecration in the sight of God. But it's all leading to a goal preordained by God. And that is God's kingdom. It will all be resolved in God's kingdom. Now, the question is, and Daniel's going to answer this question here in a minute. The question is, what about God's justice? How are the evil going to be repaid and the righteous who suffered and died for their faith going to be rewarded? How is the scales of justice going to be evened out? Okay, we understand that ultimately God's kingdom will win out. But nevertheless, are these sinners going to be in God's kingdom too, along with the righteous? Are we all going to be the same? And the answer, of course, is no. And you need to go to Daniel chapter 12, okay, the last chapter of the book, to find out how that question is answered. So as soon as you get to chapter 12, look down to verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, keep the words secret and the book sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be running back and forth, etc., etc. Okay. Did you know that in the whole Hebrew Bible, from Genesis all the way to Daniel, which is the last book written, this is the first reference to a resurrection from the dead? First and only. So that the connection to the New Testament is so stark that, okay, it can be illustrated by a story recorded in the Gospel. I think this is the Gospel. I think it's in both Matthew. I think it's in all three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's the last week of Jesus' life. He's on the temple and he's teaching people. And the Sadducees and Pharisees are present, and they're trying to trip him up, make him say something for which they can arrest him. And now it's important to understand that the Sadducees, they were the aristocracy in Jerusalem. They were like the, what do you call those guys in Russia that have all the money? Oligarchs. Okay, the Sadducees were oligarchs, okay, who conspired with the Romans in order to maintain their privileged position. They didn't believe in the resurrection. And the reason they didn't believe in it is because the only books for them that were authoritative were the books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. They didn't accept the prophets as authoritative. The Pharisees, on the other hand, did. The Pharisees accepted all the books that are in our Old Testament as authoritative. Okay, so they believed in the resurrection. Pharisees. Now the Sadducees come to Jesus with this riddle about this guy who, this woman who marries 6 different brothers and ends up childless, and they say, well, whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? They're trying to make him sound stupid. And he says, you guys are the dumb ones. People are not given in marriage in the kingdom of God. There's no need for reproduction anymore. Okay? This is eternal life we're talking about. People in the resurrection from the dead will shine like the stars in the sky, just like what Daniel said. It's almost a direct quote. So, the resurrection became a controversial subject in the first century among the Jews, but not for Jesus. For him, it was the whole point. Okay, you remain faithful to God, and you rise again to eternal life. And of course, faithfulness to God ended up meaning faithfulness to Christ, who wins your salvation on your behalf. So you receive him in your life, and he makes you righteous in the sight of God, and that turns you into a person who will shine like the stars in the sky. So that's what your future is. So next time you get depressed, think about that. Okay? That's what I tell my wife all the time. What are you depressed about? Think about the promises of God. Okay, so the book of Daniel then, in the end, it's an extremely important book. The stories illustrate the importance of faithfulness to God, and the visions are meant to teach us that God's providence is in control of human history, and human history is moving in the direction of God's kingdom. And at the end of human history, Jesus Christ will come on the clouds of heaven, the dead will rise, and there will be a final judgment. Is that simple? And that profound.
That's where I'm confused.
Yeah.
Because when we talk the other day, you said, oh, go in.
Yeah, that's true, because there's no time in eternity. Lois, don't try to comprehend it. It is impossible. Human beings cannot comprehend eternity because we live in time. We can't comprehend what it is like to live in an eternal moment that never changes, never moves. Because time governs creation. Time governs human history. Think about your lives, okay? You mentioned the Depression. Who was it that talked about it? Linda? You went through the Depression. You went through World War II. These experiences in your history prepared you to deal with hardship. And then when World War II was over, we experienced amazing prosperity because we had a population of people who lived through those disasters. And now they were prepared to build this country in a new way. And they did. And they created the strongest economy the world has ever known. And a middle class the world has never known. So, human history is constantly changing, okay? Now, we're in a period of transition right now. There's no doubt in my mind. Because of the cultural conflicts in our country right now, and the political conflicts and everything else, I think some of these mental health issues where people go completely off the rails and do evil things are a sign that some folks are unable to deal with all of the craziness that's going on right now. But I'm convinced that we're in a transition. And where it's going to go, I have no idea, but we'll find out at the time, right? Things change all the time. And Daniel's message is that ultimately the change will end in God's kingdom. So Christians need to remember to remain faithful in the face of all these changes. And if we end up in a society that's hostile to Christianity, maintain your faith anyway. Do not allow yourself to be acculturated. You'll give up the most precious thing in your life. Any other questions or comments? Does that make sense? I asked my mom, why'd you name me Daniel? Well, because of Daniel in the Bible. Okay, so next week, Esther, the only book in the Old Testament that does not refer to God even once.
Wow.
Yeah. And you'll find out why next week.
It's hard. I'm a loser. Yeah.
Ellie said she got information from you. She talked.
Okay, thank you for joining us.